It's the end of July, and you're probably thinking about summer and barbecue and pools and beaches, but you know what? The birds, they're not thinking about that at all. They're thinking about leaving. You know, my friend Em and I were out a couple of different times. One, we were at one of our favorite ponds, and we were noticing shorebirds that we haven't seen since April, all standing around, feeding up. And we're like, why are they doing here? Are they still here? One of them was Caspian terns. Another were phalaropes. And so there were birds that are showing up that we hadn't seen, like I said, for months and months and months. Then yesterday we were out driving out in the countryside, just chit-chatting about things, and we started noticing there were a lot of birds that were flying in large groups together, and some of them hanging out on wires. Wondering, what's up with that? Are these all the teenagers just kind of hanging out? And that's what we're going to talk about today. I think the thing that surprised me most while I was investigating when does fall migration actually start? It's not September. The events don't start happening after Labor Day like a lot of us think. For a lot of species, it's already underway right now. In the last week of July, which is when this podcast is being recorded, we are still in the depths of summer mode right now. And all the babies that we had seen throughout the beginning of the year, the ones I saw when I was walking out on marsh roads, those fresh feathered, slightly awkward, young-looking birds, there's an entire invisible clock that's already running and already counting down to their first migration south. And so we're going to walk through what that clock actually looks like today. So let's start with a bird that maybe you've seen. Up here in the North Woods, it's a very popular bird. We see them in marshes, we see them in parks, but it's the red-winged blackbirds. It's one of our most common nesters in our area. And its prep time is genuinely well documented, and it gives us a good template for what's happening with many of the birds over right now that's happening right now. So keep in mind, I live in the Midwest, and it's might be a little bit different for where you are, but something similar is happening with the birds you have where you're at. So a young red-winged blackbird leaves its nest well before it can fully fend for itself. The parents keep feeding it for roughly 2 more weeks after that. And then it often sticks around in the general territory, still somewhat dependent on their parents and the peer groups, the other blackbirds, for another 3 weeks after that. And so you're looking at somewhere between 4 to 5 weeks from the time it left the nest to it actually being independent. That's more than a month for a young bird to even feed itself reliably, let alone be ready to fly hundreds of miles away. And independence isn't the finish line. It's really the starting point to the next phase, because somewhere between 45 and 60 days after leaving its nest, that same young blackbird goes through what's called a pre-basic molt, shedding its soft, fresh juvenile feathers and replacing them with a set of strong sets that can actually fly long distances. And so you think about that. The feathers of a baby bird that it's born with aren't the feathers that it can migrate on at all. It has to grow an entirely new set specifically for the job. And that doesn't happen instantly. It takes weeks, running silently in the background while the bird is also learning to feed itself and dodge away from predators for the very first time. So already, weeks of continued parental support after fledging, then a few more weeks of becoming fully independent, and then replacing a full set of feathers so that it has flight feathers. None of this has anything yet to do with the fattening up, which is its own separate project. So the second half of the clock here is that it might be even more dramatic than the first one. Migrating birds just don't need working wings, they need fuel. And they need a huge amount of fuel that some of the species out there pack on so much weight it's hard to believe. So a blackpoll warbler, which is very, very tiny, weighs about 11 grams at the end of breeding season. To give you an image, I have a pet canary, and he weighs 25 grams. So this bird is so much smaller. He's almost the weight of 4 pennies, if you remember what pennies are, but it almost doubles to around 21 grams before the long flight. It's almost all fat. And so for that bird, the bird shifts basically into controlled eating binges, foraging for far more hours than normal. And some of the species even will switch their diet. Some of the insect eaters will spend, their whole summer eating bugs. They're going to start switching to high sugar berries and fruit that produces a lot more fat. I do too in summer, so that's kind of interesting. But fat packs on more energy per ounce than protein does. And that matters when every gram of weight that a bird carries is carried all the way on its way south. It has to do something beneficial for the bird. Some species even take it further by making a physical room by shrinking its internal organs. Godwits, for example, are a large shorebird. They actually reabsorb up to a quarter of the tissues in their liver, kidneys, and digestive tract before the long flight through a natural cellular recycling process. It's essentially clearing out or shrinking these organs that they won't need mid-flight to make room for fuel. Their heart and their chest muscles also grow at the same time so they can handle the extra workload of flying south. And so it's not just a diet change. The whole bird's body begins temporary remodeling itself for one task, which is to fly south. So the full prep list for the young bird now looks like this. Weeks of dependency on the parents, then somewhat independence, then gaining a whole new sets of feathers, then running alongside of all of it is a serious fattening up phase that can double its body weight. And it's not a quick turnaround. For a lot of species, we're talking about a solid 6 to 8 weeks minimum from fledging to migration ready. Sometimes it even takes more than that. But here's a detail from the prep period that I find almost the most unbelievable, that the young birds do a lot of this work completely alone. Think about this. There's no maps, no guides. Many of them fly south not with their own kind. Researchers tracking juvenile wood thrushes, which is a species that's in my area quite a bit. I love those guys. They are a pattern that will hold broadly for many, many kinds of birds. They found that once these young birds become independent, most of them make a surprising night relocation flight, sometimes a few miles away from where they hatched, before the actual migration event begins. And they're not heading south yet. They're each just kind of going in a various direction. But what they're searching for is better feeding grounds so they can fuel that molt, shedding of the old feathers and gaining the new feathers, and that fat building phase that I just described. Moving mostly just 2 hours before sunrise, what looks like random directions, then instead of like any sort of a planned trip. But it's when the true migration finally does begin. Most young songbirds make that first flight with no parents along at all. They're relying on the inherited sense of the Earth's magnetic field, the star patterns, the daylight hours, and something built into them before they ever left the egg. And it's not something that anyone ever taught them. Oftentimes, the parents will leave before the young bird leaves. And so the bird that hatches this spring and possibly has never left more than a few acres away from the nest land that they came from, now they're going to fly hundreds of miles simply by using nothing but instinct. So now to the other question, which I also love, it kind of flips the whole idea of fall migration starting in September, which is kind of stuck, I think, in a lot of our heads. Who leaves first? Well, the honest question is shorebirds, and it's not even close. Adult shorebirds that finished breeding in the Arctic start showing up moving south through the North Woods, through the Midwest, through the top rows of the United States, and the birders start seeing them again. Returns of greater and lesser yellowlegs, least sandpipers, spotted sandpipers, solitary sandpipers, in small numbers well before most of us even start thinking about fall at all. These are going to be the failed breeders or the early finishers. They're moving south weeks ahead of their own juveniles who won't follow them until late in summer. The songbirds have their own early movers too. The yellow warblers are famous for leaving early. They're one of my favorites too. But by late July, most of them are gone from the North Woods and headed for the tropics. while plenty of other species are still feeding their nest. Orchard orioles aren't far behind. Most of them have gone from the upper Midwest by late August, and making them one of the earliest songbirds to clear out entirely. This year I saw more orchard orioles than I have ever seen in my life added together. And if you head out to the marsh or an open prairie or your favorite pond in the next couple of weeks, take a look and watch utility wires, because you'll start seeing various groups of birds gathering up in restless flocks in late July. You'll see swallows. We saw grackles and other types of birds. This is often what they call staging behavior, and it's one of the earliest, most visible signs of migration that is about to begin. So here it is that when the fall migration, like I said, we picture it, people think of these big flashy waves of warblers passing through in September. And it's really just the middle of the story, because it actually started weeks ago. The earliest movers are already hundreds of miles on their trips before we even notice them. But like I said, if you notice that on your own walks out there, birds gathering in loose areas, on roadways, on wires, it's the juveniles that are usually getting into these feeding groups to support each other. They stay together. Swallows will stage on wires, roads, near open water. Any mudflats or shallows will also expose shorebirds quietly working on the edges. They're gathering up to eat and to gain that fat. And that's one of the earliest things you can see. So the next time you go out for your walk and you see some birds gathering up in groups, that's probably what's happening. Last year, my friend Em and I were out hiking, and we turned around behind us and looked, and there were hundreds of swallows standing around on the hiking trail we had just walked across. And they're feeding. They were eating, and then we said, are they leaving? Is that what's happening? They're leaving now? But what they're doing is they're getting together and having these feasts that is putting on that fat, and while they're growing their flight feathers. All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you listening or watching, however you see this. If you have anything to say to me, you can go to jillfromthenorthwoods.com and check out all the ways to contact me at the very bottom of the page. I just changed my email to northwoodsjill@fastmail.com. My other host was just too unreliable with my email and kept getting stopped. So we're just going to a professional email host and be done with it. So you can contact me. I would love to hear from you. And what are your own stories about early migration?